Thank you for coming to our session today on authentic assessment in the era of AI. Thrilled to have you all here with us, and I'll get into the general logistics and introductions. As far as general logistics, please keep actively using the chat as you feel to ask questions, to make comments, to share with each other. This is about community. This is about you. This is a professional learning experience, a community experience. So please take advantage of that as much as possible. You have so much experience and expertise to offer. And so we try to make that part of the experience as much as possible as well. So we'll be engaging you during the session, and we'll also be sharing resources with you today and also in our follow-up. You will get the recording. We do what's called a recap, which will give you the recording and related resources. Included in that is the transcript, an abridged version of the chat, I should say, because there are so many great things shared in there. You'll be able to get that as a resource afterwards as well. All right. Let's take it away. This is part one of a three-part series that we're doing over the next couple of months. We're looking at authentic learning to career readiness, and you can kind of see the progression there. That second session is confirmed, and we'll give you the information for that at the end. We'll give you the registration link, and you'll also get that in a follow-up email as well. But we're excited to have a couple of great presenters that I'll talk about at the end of the session for that next one. We'll focus on today's great presenters here in just a moment. Goals will clarify what makes an assessment authentic. Everybody knows about authentic assessment, but what does it really mean? How can we dig into that? How can we really define it and look at examples would be the great way to do it, is actually walking through examples, looking at transitions from traditional to authentic. I won't say much more, obviously, because we'll get to that in the main part of the section. We'll talk about deliverables. We'll talk about linking to careers and workplace skills. We'll talk about AI and how that may play a role, how that can effectively play a role, and then also where you might put in some guardrails, of course. And then having you engage with each other to share your expertise, and then thinking about leaving with one assessment makeover idea that you can apply in the near future. So we'll get to that stage as well. All right, I'll introduce myself briefly. Brett Christie, VP for Educational Innovation at Alchemy, excuse me. I've been in that role a little over 5 years. Before that, 25 years in higher education as faculty, then faculty developer at the campus, and then system level for the Cal State system. More excited to introduce my two presenters here today, and it's been a pleasure getting to know them just recently. I was aware of this session, the similar session they did at CU Boulder, and that was shared on the AI in Education listserv. And I looked into it and thought, this is great. I'd love to have them, and we're thinking about this series. It'd be a perfect fit. Not only that, is I've really enjoyed talking to them. They just seem like really bright, fun people to be around, and so I've enjoyed that virtually, at least. Not virtually enjoyed it virtually. So I'll start with Chris. Chris is an assistant teaching professor as well as a learning and AI strategist at University of Colorado Boulder. He has an extensive background in course and curriculum design and also supporting students as a writing consultant. And then Karen is an instructional design and technology consultant through the Center for Teaching and Learning there. She's also worked as a professional research assistant and a lecturer for the International English Center. So that's just a quick snapshot. I know they have much more in their background, but that's more recent and what I'm familiar with. So pleasure to have them here today, and I'm very appreciative. All right, as usual, we have pre-poll questions that we have you briefly do during the registration process. So let's take a look at what you told us, our pulse check. So how confident are you that your major assessments mirror real work in your field? And so you can see right away the biggest was 305, or about 43% at somewhat. And then just below that in percentage, mostly with 38%. So about 70% were at the somewhat or comfortable level with this. And so this boiled down, as far as interpreting that, is that as a group, everybody's partway there. People are on a journey. You can see a subset of 64 or 9% feel very confident. The rest are, maybe still exploring and still refining and here to learn more from each other today. So that's great. Okay, and let's look at pre-poll question number 2 briefly. So which authenticity move would help one of your key assessments the most right now? And that may change over the course of this session, but just your thinking coming into this session. So the biggest one, of course, is defining credible assignment deliverables or artifacts. So as you go from a traditional that might be an exam, it might be a traditional term paper, what could other credible artifacts look like? So that's a new area for you to explore is how to step back from some of those traditionals that you probably experienced over and over. And maybe as an instructor you've been doing, what could it look like to have different types of things for students to develop? And then the other one, adding metacognitive reflection. That could include AI, but metacognitive reflection, always thinking about the process of learning and then linking that reflection ideally to career readiness skills could be a great way to go. Speaking of career readiness, if you are familiar with the NACE, National Association for Career Education competencies, those are great touch points to think about, and I'll share that link in the chat with you momentarily. They have great resources to get you going on that as well. So we've featured those in other sessions. We're not doing that today necessarily. And then you can see some of the other results there, aligning your rubrics to real world criteria. So those might shift, but also you might go back to your course outcomes. Does any of the language there shift to bring in more of the real world process or product? So you might think of alignment in those senses as well. Okay, so let's do a little bit of group microframing about authentic assessment here. What we're going to do is occasionally we do what's called an answer garden. Some of you have experienced these before, and I know we'll have the link going into the chat. There you go. I'll pause here with the QR code as you go to the answer garden in 20 characters or less, so 1 to 2 words. How would you define authentic assessment? And you can submit more than once, and we'll get a sense of where you are coming into this moment in the session. Okay, and I'll go ahead and join you there now. Answer Garden is free. You'll get these ads at the bottom, but look, you can make them go away. Sort of.
This is always the hardest to distill what's an authentic assessment in one word or a short phrase.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I don't think about defining it, but what is a word that comes to mind? Just sort of free association. And I'm going to refresh here so we'll start seeing the tag cloud build.
I've just been over here typing the same word over and over and hitting enter to really. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, Chris is on real world. He sometimes he hyphened it, sometimes he didn't.
Okay, I was consistent. Okay. Yeah, no.
So that's the main one, obviously, that's largest, but also has multiple instances of applicable is another great one. Relevant, yeah. And so relevant in a larger context than your classroom. Obviously, what you're teaching, you want to think of as relevant to what's important for the students to learn, but it's externally relevant as well. It's long-term relevant. So I like that. That's great. Let me refresh here and see if we have any new leads come in. A link in the chat again, please.
Oh, this is lovely. This is great.
Meaningful. That's a new one that popped out. Great. Practical. Yeah, applied would be another one that I'm sure is in there somewhere as well. Applicable, yes. Real life. I'm looking kind of around the edges, higher order thinking. You can think about that with blooms, let's say. That'll come up later. Work related aligns with your outcomes. That's always the goal for sure. Professional examples, real world connection. I always have a hard time with real world.
Yeah, me too. I love less boring to great. I appreciate that
Oh,
as just like an honest one to throw out there.
nice. Student centered, always a good thing. AI resistant, yeah, and so you'll figure out what's appropriate with your task and your outcomes. How much AI may or may not play a role. We'll talk about that for sure. Tangible, I like that. Okay, last refresh. We won't hang here all day. Okay, intentional. Always great to have intentionality. Mirrors real life. Okay, I'm going to stop. This is fun. Thank you for contributing that, and we'll capture that and put it into the deck that we'll be sharing out later. So let me jump back to the slides here. And you know what? Actually, Chris, I'll stop share and you'll take it away. And Karen, you'll be presenting next.
Sounds
Sounds
great.
good.
Perfect. You guys hit the nail on the head with a lot of the words that you guys found. So like I really loved relevant and real world and all of that is great stuff. So we'll go in a little bit with a definition here. Perfect. Thank you, Chris, for driving. I appreciate you.
Glad to drive.
Yeah, so we do have a definition here from Andreatos. That's from 2023. But really, authentic assessment is like giving students a dress rehearsal for the real world instead of just performing those academic tasks. We really do want to invite them to tackle those meaningful tasks. And I saw that word in the word cloud, so I really appreciate that. But yeah, you're looking for things that will mirror what they're actually going to do in careers and sort of like an outside real world experience. And it is grounded in social constructivism. So it's not just about testing the knowledge, but building it rather through context, relevance, and skills that are also adjacently related to the discipline. So when we think about AI, there's been a big movement at universities. I don't know about your university or where you're at, but I saw a lot of academics here and such a wide range of knowledge and appreciate that. But we're seeing sort of a movement back to let's bring everyone in person. Let's look at Scantrons. Let's go back to having those essays, as a response to AI and normal, right? But when you think of authentic assessment, it can actually be like an antidote to sort of those traditional methods. And so we'll talk a little more about this later, but it's not necessarily about having the output or perfection in some of this, but it's the process over perfection, which I really like. So it's looking at encouraging students to think critically, reflect deeply, collaborate meaningfully, which is something that higher education really is not going to lose, right? That collaboration, being able to have community. Well, we have certain crises in higher ed. I think here we are, we're able to think it's about authentic assessments, which can be messy, it can be creative, and also can be more aligned with how students and how learning actually would work outside of the classroom. So, and what students are looking for. When students engage in authentic assessments, we're not asking them to check the boxes and focus more on their growth. And so we can actually get a clearer picture of what they really understand and how the learning connects to the world beyond the four walls or virtual classrooms that we have. So it is an opportunity for the deeper learning and a more, equitable way to evaluate students. So we've got here some key characteristics on what might be emphasized. So process, relevance, critical thinking, creativity, problem solving over just the recall and rote memorization. So it really can be a wonderful place to start when you're looking at assessments. Thanks, Chris. So, authentic assessment really thrives when students feel a sense of ownership over their learning. That's agency. So, in a world where AI tools and products can generate content in seconds, right? And we now have this ability, our students actually need to be better than AI. And that's something that we can work on in the classroom with these assessments. So, not just an output, but an insight, creativity, ethical reasoning that starts with learner agency and kind of getting to know yourself and feeling that you have the drive and grit when it comes to your own learning. So, if we can move beyond that one size fits all assignment, and students get to choose topics and formats that resonate with their passion, their lived experiences, they're more likely to engage in the course content and also engage deeply and produce more meaningful work. So, this isn't about just being like trendy co-creation, but it can be transformative for students at different levels. For example, as former faculty, I would have students in a classroom and I might open up a choice to say, you could write something, you could produce a video, you could do a podcast, and the students that would choose podcast and creating videos, they're also learning additional skills besides just writing the paper, which is also essential, right? I'm not saying it's not, especially in certain disciplines. It's absolutely necessary to be a good communicator. But if a student is connected to the course concept and their community work, and then they have the choice on how to complete, it can also be a game changer in the classroom and really, really help with engagement. So, we also know that like reflection, this metacognitive reflection is foundational. And so when students articulate how they approach the task, what challenged them, how they grew, they took that moment out, they're really building those metacognitive muscles that can serve them throughout a lifetime, right? Like we're not just trying to get them to graduation, but we're thinking about cultivating a skill set. So when you consider a student who struggled early in a course, but then had formative assessments along the way as means of reflection, or had pausing points and an authentic assessment, they were able to identify maybe a learning strategy, were able to reflect and even turn things around if things aren't going well. So just a great place. And so when we stop grading the final product, like that's the whole part of it is the final product and that final grade, we can actually start looking at assessing thinking beyond the work. So it's a lot of times, like I said, process versus the output with this drafts, the feedback loops, the design choices. We're actually cultivating critical thinkers and someone who's thinking about the path and journey.
Yeah, and kind of jumping on that, that assessing thinking over output, there's a whole conversation in chat here about why, right? And kind of like Karen said, I just want to hit on this again. We now live in a world where someone can hit a button and thoughtlessly churn out product over and over. The quality will vary, that's a whole separate thing, but you could churn out infinite products right away. So we really have to shift our focus to process, making students who can make informed decisions and actually know with intentionality why they're doing what they're doing and creating anything is so essential right now. So other ways that you can fit these things in your class. So if you are trying to make that pivot to assessing thinking over output, in this era of AI, you really have to hit AI literacy early and often, right? I would really encourage from the beginning of your class to have conversations with your students about safe and ethical use and also transparency and modeling those things on your own. Anytime you use AI in any way, even if you're just using it to, I don't know, proofread a lecture, just tell your students that. Norm that transparency. Beyond that, hear your student concerns and express your own, right? I have more than once with my students had the whole like flip the chair around and sit down and be like, real talk, kids. But I'm talking about the concerns I have with AI. And then when I give them the floor, they have so much. Renee, I prefer, if I'm going to be really annoying, I prefer critical AI literacy from the Furs and Perkins and all that tradition. But I also don't want to be that person who spends a ton of time debating over AI fluency versus AI literacy when I think what we're teaching, the inside of that matters so much more. But I do get that nuance. But anyway, beyond that, I encourage you to get your students in the habit of sharing LLM chats, right? If we're talking a lot about real world, this is very much a professional expectation in a lot of companies already. I have multiple friends who work in a ton of different industries where sharing, if they use LLM, they are usually submitting that chat or their work just has access to it anyway. And kind of norming that for your students can go a long way, but it also gives you insight into that process. Seeing how they're using these tools is kind of that first step towards metacognitive conversations on that. Beyond that, I'd really, again, focusing on that process rather than product, build in more scaffolding. If you think you have too much scaffolding, you might not. Definitely re-examine. Scaffolding is worth its weight in gold right now in these assignments, right? Anytime where you can get your student to pause and look at what they've created and figure out why and how it could be better, that is essential. Beyond that, make it multimodal. Have parts of this that are entirely about visuals and presentations and talking through it orally. Have parts of this that are about creating a written plan. Have parts that are graphical organizers, whatever, right? But making students approach this from various angles, again, really gets to that like metacognitive angle. Also, finally, have those assignments grow into a portfolio. Your students at the end get to leave with a collection of pieces that literally show their thinking. These artifacts that show how they thought through a problem, that's going to be really helpful for them in some ways. And again, in certain fields, that can also be helpful professionally. Also, for this, I really encourage collaborative work. This is a small thing, but I think people don't think this through often enough. But if you throw your students in groups in this moment with AI, they as a group have to self-discuss the ethics, right? And I see this in my class every time. We just got done with an authentic assessment on advertising and rhetoric and rhetorical analysis and all that. And I had groups in 4. And the first thing I heard one of the groups doing was talking about how much is too much Chat GPT. They'll self-police and they'll self-find those lines in a way that can be pretty helpful. And for what it's worth, by the way, where they set the line was actually more conservative than I set the line in my actual course policies, which was interesting. And then finally, have these regular reflective pieces, right? If you are breaking stuff into scaffolding, that on its own isn't worth a ton unless you have students pausing to reflect on the why. Okay, I just did this draft. What do I think went well? What still needs work? How am I going to do that work? Just forcing them to really encounter that, that is so huge. And that can really save a lot of these assignments in class time. And moving on, I've seen a bunch of things in chat right now about the pros and cons of authentic assessment. And, we're not naive. We're both classroom teachers, and we wanted to make sure we actually hit both those things, right? I'm a big believer any PD that just presents anything as magic is a bad PD, right? Look, the pros of this can improve critical thinking in problem solving and all that. It also can improve student engagement and satisfaction. It's more accurate professional scenarios without necessarily sacrificing the content or the more abstract skills you care about your students learning. And also, it allows for different modalities of demonstrating learning, and therefore, just different types of learners will have success in different parts, or have an advantage at least in different parts. They can hopefully can all have success everywhere. And then finally, it gives that increased metacognition. In the literature around AI right now, that lack of metacognition is huge. Anything we can do to build that bulwark of students asking, how am I using this? And then being honest with themselves, that is worth your time. But on the con side, look, tons of studies show that this deferred at a freshman level versus an upper level class, which makes sense, right? If you're someone about to potentially start your career, you probably do care a little bit more about things mimicking work, quote unquote, rather than if you're like a freshman student who you're 18 or 19 and you're just brand new to college. Beyond that, it is essential that these assessments are helpful in this moment, but it doesn't AI proof an assignment. I would generally argue nothing AI proofs an assignment, short of a ton of like one-on-one work. AI resistant, sure. But at the end of the day, if a student was like, I really want to break all the ethical rules, they could find a way. Beyond that, in certain contexts, authentic assessment has no impact on integrity. One of the examples of this is Kofinas, who was looking at a British business school, right? But it does seem like you have to really make that value argument of why the stuff you're teaching matters. If you can do that and then add authentic assessments on, that's great. But if the reason your class matters is it's going to make you a lot of money, students are still going to be motivated by that primarily, which is fine, but just something you should be aware of. And then finally, it can be a substantial time investment for you as faculty to reorient your course in this direction. It's changing the way you grade things. We were talking in chat about the way that you would have to change the way you message rubrics to your students. Difficult to standardize. Again, my experience has been that you can standardize it, but it takes way more time actually communicating with students in the classroom what this grading looks like. And then finally, at the end of the day, some of this content can still be Gen AI'd. I don't know if that works as a verb. But again, just because some of it can, when added with other sorts of changes to your class, it doesn't mean all of it will be. And in my experience, at least, this has gotten more buy-in with my students, which if you're a big Trisha Bertram Callant reader, that buy-in is the number one resistance to the people Gen AIing lazily. But anyway, there are some differences between traditional and authentic assessments. Go ahead, Karen.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah. So we wanted to just take a moment and look at contrast traditional versus authentic assessment. And so traditional assessment often asked, did the student get the correct answer? And authentic assessments can ask, how did the student arrive at their understanding and can they apply it in the real world? And so that is a shift from measuring performance in isolation to really cultivating some of these transferable skills through meaningful tasks, right? And so again, in some of these traditional ones, you're focused on memorization and recall, and exams and quizzes have their place. So again, when I think about formative and also foundational knowledge, it's not necessarily trying to get rid of that, but when you over rely on just the recall-based formats, you risk assessing short-term memory rather than long-term learning. And so these methods often prioritize individual performance and correctness over maybe creativity and collaboration. And so authentic assessments, invite students to engage in those real-world problems, whether it's through, and we'll talk about some of this stuff in a minute, portfolios, community-based project, interdisciplinary case studies. It's not just about what they know, but how they use it. And it can be especially powerful when students reflect on their process and also collaborate with others. Thanks, Chris. And so we've got some different types. And again, I love what you guys are doing in the chat right now with building communities, supporting each other, asking additional questions. I see a lot of engagement. So if we are missing an assessment type here for our authentic assessments, please feel free to throw that in the chat and share with everyone. But here's kind of our bucket of where we have some of these community-based projects, concept mapping, fact deconstruction, case studies have been big, research projects, simulations and role plays. And I'm going to pause here as a former Model United Nations leader and student. When I was back in the day at the university, I loved taking on a role and building empathy and critical thinking, and also just being a character for a moment and getting outside of myself. And so, role plays and simulations, they have their place. And, there's a whole pedagogy on reacting and being in historical time. So I just, I'm making a shameless plug for role play and, and play and joy in general in the classroom, right? So then we've got portfolios, which actually could be super useful for students outside of the class, especially if you're having them kind of compile different works or showcasing their knowledge, and sort of making steps to creating a professional portfolio. It's fantastic. Project-based learning, that really gets me going as well. Like you can tell, I love authentic assessments versus a paper. Creating a system or an artifact, again, something that can be utilized later, looked back on, reflected after the class is fantastic. Service learning, becoming part of the community, learning hands-on skilled, experiential, oral interviews. And then again, being able to play with some maybe technology tools, infographics, video projects. That might not be discipline specific, but then something that's going to be utilized across disciplines and in career later. So great ways to get involved. And I'm going to look at the chat really quick. Oh, debate is in here. That's fantastic. I love that you guys put some of that in there. So yeah, D&D in the classroom. Yes, I haven't tried that, but I would not be opposed at all. Simulations. Perfect. Thank you guys for adding a few of these.
So I'm seeing a bunch of discussion in the chat right now about the way that AI still impacts these different types of assignments with authentic assessment. And just to double back on this, we're not claiming that this is some magic bullet. Like I said up front, anyone who's trying to sell you a magic bullet is a con man, right? I do not claim that. Also, I will say, I do think it depends on the type of university and institution you're at. But right now, if your goal is keeping AI out of the classroom, I just personally, in my experience at CU, that has just not been possible, right? 80 to 90% of my students self-report using AI weekly. And I can, rather than trying to fight the fight and put all my fingers in the different holes in the dam, so to speak, I've been moving my attention towards teaching ethical use, teaching responsible use, and teaching kind of how these things might impact your learning better or worse. And teaching that skepticism as part of AI literacy and making my students more discerning on when they use it. You were asking about how do we keep AI out of these authentic assessments? My 2 cents would be get more buy-in, right? One of the things I like about authentic assessment is it gets my students to actually see the point of my material, and then fewer of them are trying to cut corners. Not everyone. And then for those ones, I still rely on my more traditional, old school, detecting and honor coding and all that policy, my whole mosaic approach talk that some of you might have seen. But anyway, jumping ahead, I just wanted to answer that question from chat. So AI's impact on assessment, right? This actually is a perfect transition. It has made security impossible. I think that might be an overly blunt way to say it, and I think some people are unhappy with that. But I would encourage you, go look at the AI in higher ed group today. This giant 60 message long thread about the impact of the new Meta sunglasses. I get not the Ray-Bans, they made new ones that are cheaper. And, tons of schools are now really having issues around that. Even the move to returning to in-person Blue Book exams is deeply faulted and not secure. Right? Nothing is AI proof in this current moment. That's just the reality. And as more agentic AI browsers come out, God, that's going to add so much more complexity to that. Again, I'm not claiming that our talk has all the answers. What I'm claiming is that our talk has at least a way to get more engagement and more buy-in from your students, which again, if you're a Trisha Bertram Gallant reader, is part of the way that you're not going to de-AIify your class, but you're at least going to make it harder for students to talk themselves. You're going to give them moral hurdles to talking themselves into cutting those corners when they actually see the value. But anyway, beyond that, scaffolding has become so much more important. Even if you're just worried about an academic integrity angle, a great way to catch someone using AI dishonestly is scaffolding. If they suddenly don't have a paper, don't have an outline, don't have a peer review, but then all of a sudden have a fully final draft, that's sus, right? Scaffolding, even in the most cynical situation, gives you some insight into those things. Beyond that, it makes that AI has made that multimodal approach way more important, right? Suddenly, having students do a lot of little pieces is really important because that, again, gives us that authenticity of work and lets us see who's doing what. It also has impacted Bloom's on every level. I'm sure some of you have seen Bloom's taxonomy with AI from Casorla, right? But there's tons of different people. Literally, AI has impacted learning in such a way that we are questioning basic principles right now. So if you told me that 5 years from now, a bunch of research came out that actually showed there's a different way to do assessments, sure, I would totally believe that. But what I'm saying is that right now, according to the research, this is that way to get that buy-in. Beyond that, this has shifted us towards a reviewing process and ability to discuss and utilize those concepts, right? My student turning in a grammatically perfect paper for me is now no longer proof that they understand grammar. But my students being able to write a piece showing me and explaining why they did certain things in their writing, and if they can maybe even orally discuss that in a meeting, oh my God, suddenly that shows they actually understood process. And then moving on, AI's impact on integrity. I mean, hey, I had to hit this one pretty hard. It created massive gray areas. I would say the majority of students that I have caught cheating in my classroom earnestly didn't know where the line was. Didn't mean they crossed the line, or sorry, didn't mean they didn't cross the line, too many negatives. Didn't mean they didn't make a mistake. But in this moment, I would really encourage you to just imagine being a student where you have 5 different classes that have 5 totally different like policies on AI use and that message it differently. And some of them are vague and just say, don't use AI. And the other one's vague and says, feel free to use AI. But what does that mean? We're in a moment where the lines are is super blurry. And that sucks. It sucks for our faculty. It sucks for our students. It sucks for everyone. So make a point of clarifying those things in your classroom. But what does using AI mean? That's not clear any longer. What if you use Grammarly and you are just using the replace tools to make it sound smarter tools? Is that cheating? Because a lot of students do that, right? What about Google Docs and their grammar and spell check, which is now LLM powered? Fun fact, it actually made it less accurate as a side note. But anyway, is that using AI? There's also just tons of unenforceable rules that I see all the time, right? Students just being told, don't use AI to study. How are you possibly going to enforce that? Right. And I'm often reminded of this. Years ago, there was a Reddit discussion where they were interviewing astronauts. And one of the questions that came up in this AMA was, why is the space station so dirty? And I think it was the Canadian guy, forget his name, but his answer was basically, who's going to come clean it? They can't come make us. We're up in space. And I think about that moment all the time. Like that powerlessness to enforce those rules is the same thing we're all feeling right now with AI. I can tell my students a bazillion times not to do things a certain way. They're still gonna if they want to. What I need to do instead, rather than telling them, is showing them why certain things are better or worse. And then finally, the last thing with AI's impact on integrity is that it has totally lowered the barriers to cheating. Look, cheating has always been easy. It's always existed. If you had the money, you could go to unemployedphds.com and have someone write a paper for you. They literally write dissertations for money, right? You could have them prep you on a defense. You literally could cheat your entire way to becoming a professor through that website in the 90s if you wanted to. So why didn't you? You probably didn't because you saw the value in the work you were doing. You were motivated and engaged and you cared and it was deeply personally meaningful to you. And this type of redesigning your assessments is part of trying to hit that same drive in your students. But like, look, the likelihood to cheat relies on a ton of variable. Ease, peer norming, moral disengagement are all huge. And all of those things are things AI has impacted. It has made it easier. It's never been easier to make bad papers. Peers are all using it, so it norms it entirely. And moral disengagement is huge. The average user lies themselves about how much they use AI all the time, or how much they're relying on it, how much they're leaning on it in these ways. Beyond that, it's literally built into Chrome and Canvas now. It could not be easier, to be blunt. And then finally, AI encourages pushing boundaries just generally. If you haven't read this Cobus et al. Paper, this is the one looking at sort of increasingly morally gray decisions that people using LLMs find themselves in and how they often will cross some ethical lines they definitely would not if they were interacting with a human agent. That's interesting to me. So the impact AI has had on integrity is huge. We're not blind to that. This is not a solution to that writ large, but it is a solution to getting that buyback.
Yeah, and it's interesting to be thinking about too. I mean, I know my vibe in the classroom is less about policing and more about trying to cultivate learners and have, I think people put into the chat like a transparency with why you're doing certain things. And so I think that's really important to have those conversations. And as Chris mentioned before, that critical literacy, having discussions and conversations with students and learners in the classroom seem really great. When we're talking about rethinking assessments, because again, in the age of AI, a lot of us have had to go back and sort of be thinking about how are these assessments, how do we need to redo them, as AI becomes more prolific and we see students using it, rather than being threatened, it's a great opportunity to rethink what we're assessing and how we are assessing. So the question isn't just can students complete the task, but is the task still meaningful when AI is involved? That might be a good moment to pause and actually have a pedagogical reflection or renewal for us as, as instructors and as educators. And so if we start by asking, does this assignment still measure what I want it to measure? Now that AI can do parts of it, if the answer is no, it is time to redesign. And so again, it's not abandoning academic rigor, but really refining the relevance in our classrooms. And so not all tasks are equally vulnerable to AI automation. As Chris mentioned, it is possible. Nothing's truly AI proof. But when you start looking at reflective journals, personal narratives, and connections for learners' career goals, it's harder for AI to fake. And it's more valuable for students to actually write and to be thinking on their own. So frequent formative assessments can help us track that growth and authenticity. And then authentic redesign isn't just about avoiding AI either. Sometimes, and I think they've mentioned this in the chat before, it's about embracing some of the tools or what makes, human learning powerful. Can you incorporate part of it or scaffold? But when we align those assessments in general with students' future goals, we're not just protecting academic integrity, but we're also enhancing that motivation and meaning for our learners. And they're able to make those connections for themselves. And someone put in the chat, do you want them to lift up the weights in the weight room, or do you want the trainer that you've hired to do, or a platform or technology to do that? And so I think, again, it speaks to having these great conversations in the classroom. Good opportunity for that. And then when it comes to designing authentic assessments, this is not just a one-size-fits-all endeavor. It can also be deeply contextual. So whether you're teaching a 300-person lecture or a hybrid seminar or a capstone studio, the key is to align your assessments with your learning objectives and the professional realities your students might be preparing for. So a quick litmus test here is the task realistic? Does it require critical thinking or problem solving in a more novel context? Are students getting feedback and chances to improve? If you can say yes to these, you're on the right track in your redesign. And again, as every year and every course that we've taught, authentic assessments are also iterative, right? So students need opportunities to practice, receive feedback, and also revise. And so a beautiful part of this, and I hear if someone's in like a large lecture course, it can be a real slog to have to grade and go back and have so many of these types of authentic assessments that you're looking at. However, peer and self-assessments are a great way. It's not just learning the content, but how you evaluate quality, how you communicate critique, how can you reflect on your own growth? So those parts can also be baked in so it can alleviate some of the grading pieces, but also puts it back on the students and learners to be thinking about those parts of their own assessments.
So we wanted to take kind of a sample traditional assessment here and just kind of go through a few ways that we might blow this up into something else, right? How do we make this more authentic? So I actually went and grabbed, this was a verbatim essay prompt. I actually fixed a typo in it, but otherwise verbatim essay prompt that I was given when I first started teaching. When I first took over my first class, this was one of the essay prompts that was given to me by the previous faculty member. So pick a topic or discussion in this course that has caught your interest and write a 10-page argumentative research paper on it. You have a lot of freedom in this paper, so I'm requiring each of you to check with me beforehand by week 11 in regards to your topic. You are expected to have not only the primary sources you use, but at least 3 secondary sources as well. Maybe I didn't fix that typo. Focus is often on structure, citations, demonstrating knowledge, but also in some ways, this task is kind of a classically performative one. You're writing a essay type that there are certain fields where this might be, I guess, a form of authentic, but not really. So how could we modernize this? How could we make this a more authentic assignment? Any ideas in chat?
We've all had this, right?
Yeah.
Write a long paper, cite your resources.
Here, I'll leave the prompt up in case that's helpful. But how would you make this more authentic, more relevant, more, I don't know, engaging to your students based on some of the things we've talked about in this training?
Yeah, scaffolding would
Yeah.
help. Appreciate
I would,
that.
yep,
Our
scaffolding for sure, providing some real world experiences, narrowing it a little for sure,
choice on topics, that's great.
including videos and presentation, absolutely.
Ooh.
Ooh, I love Maha. I always love your work, but also, yeah, going out there and interviewing people, absolutely. Underappreciated, but a legitimately hard skill. Also, especially post pandemic, where a lot of students are anxious about this sort of thing, giving them an excuse to actually practice interviewing can be, I have found, well received.
Oh, I like the pairs of students can debate it.
Yeah.
That's great too.
Multimodal pieces. Pretend you're an influencer and try to convince Darcy. Are you secretly a student in here? No, I love that.
Have learners create mini lessons on topics and present them to a real or hypothetical audience. Fantastic.
Yeah, and ultimately, if you're someone who's not quite sure what we're looking for here, I think what I want to throw out there is, look, think of the original goals of this assignment. We were trying to get students to learn a lot about about a topic, to deep dive some research, to organize all those ideas into a structure, even if that structure was sort of artificial. But we had these very specific goals. I would argue almost all those goals are still attainable, right? But we have to kind of reapproach how we get to them. I want my students to learn a lot about whatever topic they pick. This semester, I have a weird number of students writing about concussions in the NFL. I don't know. But they want to learn a lot about that. Great. Rather than writing one mega paper, they're probably going to write a lot of little pieces in little modalities and different forms that force them to sort of work out different muscles. But at the end of the class, they're probably going to have learned as much about that topic as they would have traditionally. Right. And that's sort of the goal. Sure, maybe they don't put it together into this one artificial paper structure, but suddenly now they have 6 different pieces, different modalities that are aimed at different audiences. That's huge. The ideas in this chat are I love a collective newspaper.
I looked the zine Lee put in there, like had the whole class contribute to a zine. I love that. It's fantastic.
I
Create
love this.
TikTok. You guys are nailing it. We should probably show you some of our ideas because I think you guys got it. So
Yeah. Unfortunately, go ahead.
yeah, we did play around with this. Like what would we do if we had the opportunity? So this was something that we just thought about was, we mentioned a community project, especially a community engaged project. So maybe students are identifying a local challenge, food insecurity, digital divide, climate resilience, depends on the discipline that you're teaching, right? And then a proposed solution informed by the course concepts. So like deliverables might be a policy brief, an infographic, a video presentation for a real audience. So you guys nailed it completely in the chat. And then we looked at maybe we wanted to make a multimedia portfolio with reflective commentary. So this could be where students submit a mix of blog posts, short videos, annotated readings, AI assisted drafts. Again, depending on your personal pedagogy of how you want to include or not include AI as part of the tools or platforms that students can use. But these could be a reflective essay explaining how they used them. What did they learn out of it? Was it wrong? Was it incorrect? Were they able to discover biases, hallucinations, and ways that there were gaps? And how did their thinking evolve? I think that's kind of the more important part of this. And then we also looked at a few other ways we could make it more authentic, incorporate that peer collaboration and iterative feedback, as we've discussed before. So maybe students are working in small groups, they explore a shared question, contributing to a piece, literature review, data analysis, interviews. Those feedback loops, the group presentation, individual reflections can all be built into maybe how you're assessing the collaboration and individual learning, because we always know someone's going to say group project, assigning roles, that type of thing. So there are other considerations when you've got that, but also we looked at real world resources and expertise or experts. So as maybe students explore a field, discipline, profession they're curious about, conducting interviews, attending workshops, reviewing professional materials with reflection. So, that could be frequent check-ins and reflection pieces. Again, we're really trying to get learner agency, learner growth, encourage that curiosity that we have as humans.
So Here, there's just kind of just really nice. And again, obviously, I don't think all of us can do this. Hey, everyone, just go buy a house and turn it into a fake crime scene really quick. Uh, I'm sure your department has the bucks for that, but still, like I look at this as sort of one of those things I would aspire to be able to do, right? Right? They're teaching crime theory, forensics, and all that. And so instead, they have this house where they're teaching criminal, like actual career skills. They have students coming in and actually mocking up and going through a lot of these processes rather than just writing a paper on how it would work. Instead of doing a presentation on what fingerprint analysis would look like, they get to come in and practice. And in a very real way, like I have a hard time imagining, because I'm sure there are reflection papers and stuff after this. It'd be possible for students to chat GPT some parts of that, I'm sure. But at the end of the day, I have a hard time imagining them, using AI to cut through all of the corners, first of all. And second of all, even if they somehow were able to, I feel like this is an engaging enough assignment that I think a lot of students would be disincentivized, we'll say. Moving on though, we also want to talk about kind of supporting authentic and AI resilient assessment more generally. So first, rubrics. We've been talking a bunch in the chat about rubrics, but have those rubrics with clear criteria. Have that stuff be transparent, and if let your students have questions. I open up every paper by having just like a 15 to 20-minute chat session about why am I assigning this? What are the goals here? What are questions you all have? And let's go over the rubric together. In my experiences, first of all, there's tons of stuff I thought was clear that wasn't. Spoilers, my students don't realize that a presentation means more than just a slide deck. They actually have to present it, right? That never would have occurred to me as a disconnect until I had that conversation. So even then, just having this conversation helps students feel a lot less anxious. It'll also help you identify some places where maybe you could iron out some wrinkles. Beyond that, though, be AI aware. Give students negative consequences for unapproved AI use, right? At the end of the day, you should still be enforced, like have an AI policy that you are holding the line on. None of this was to say, oh yeah, if you do authentic assessment, your students, you can just take your hands off the wheel. No, but I do think, again, that just being clear on what your AI policy is, being communicative on where those lines are, how you explore those lines, if you're using AI detection or not, your students should 100% know that. They should know what software you're using and what your policy is if you find a positive and all that. And then beyond that, though, students might be aware that AI generated text is unreliable and have other skepticisms themselves. My experience has been that when I have this conversation with my students, many of them are more negative on AI than I am. And that itself is a great sort of bonding moment where we can, as a class, discuss a lot of those anxieties and how we as a community, professor and students, address that. And then finally, feedback, right? Use things like annotation tools or whatever, things that have the ability to give peer feedback, but also your faculty feedback to students is essential. And I would encourage you to give more low stakes feedback regularly rather than like one big thing every few weeks, right? If there's a single assessment every 3 weeks, that is so much less helpful in this current AI education moment than just like a weekly journal post that you're giving some feedback to every week. That can really help students because again, you're getting into that process then. So at the end of the day, that was our authentic makeover journey. I'm going to stop sharing here. Brett, I'm throwing this back to you.
Find my microphone. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Karen. And again, the chat for just going on and on with lots of great sharing and support for each other as well. I've seen people almost beating themselves up a little bit after they've seen all of the ideas and possibilities. But again, pick and choose and decide your next steps. And that's kind of where we're going next. It is where we are going next for you to think about, okay, what could I be doing differently? What could be the next step in my journey? So let me share out. And if I didn't see it already, there's the link to the Padlet. And let me just go to that tab. And if you're new to Padlet, which at this day I would imagine most of you have, you can pick the first column, something you've already changed, and share it by clicking on the plus icon. If you're newer or you're thinking of a next step you want to take, you can click the plus icon in that middle column. And then what are some examples of career signals in the things that you're doing or want to do? So a career-based outcome or tangible as a result. What is something that would move forward with the student? What is something they could potentially share with an employer for an internship or for an actual job that shows, I learned this and this is how I'm able to apply it. This is where I'm ready to go. And I will refresh, but I know this takes some thinking time as well.
You guys did such an excellent job in the chat sharing these ideas. So I like that we're putting it on Padlet for posterity,
Yeah.
right? So we're able to go back, review, and look at some of these things because I have been so impressed with this community and the ideas in the chat and how people are supporting each other. It's lovely.
And some of you could scroll back up and copy and paste and put it into the chat. But the reason why we do the Padlet is we keep this available. And so this is a resource where you'll have access to others' ideas. We also like to do an analysis of the Padlet. So I actually will use ChatGPT and be able to do an analysis. And people talk about, ChatGPT has built-in biases. Well, if I was an instructor and I was looking at the work of students on, a parking lot board in a class or Post-its or a Padlet, I'm going to filter through my own biases. So by using ChatGPT, I feel like I'm sort of neutralizing things a little bit to where I'm getting hopefully a neutral interpretation of what's been submitted. All right, great. I'm going to pause here for a moment. We're coming down toward the final stretch of our session. We're okay on time here. Have one last demonstration and next steps you can make. And that's kind of where I'm leaning in here, what people are thinking about as a result of today's presentation and community dialogue, zines. And so, yeah, how to make it not just that regular format paper. How can they create interest and excitement and bring in more of themselves or more pieces and elements into the process? More discussion about Boodlebox. So some people will be looking into that as a good space for students to be doing ethical work and be accountable. Talking to the Dean of Curriculum to review the webinar. Great. Hope this is useful for having that dialogue. More formative focus. So scaffolding, that term has come up a couple times. If you're newer to that term, it could mean how can you take something that is a big, huge process with one final end product and break it up into pieces, and those pieces build upon one another toward the end product. I have always called it part, whole, is another way of looking at it. Getting more of those formatives built in, checkpoints, opportunities to give feedback, opportunities to see if something's going awry and a correction needs to be made, whether by you or by a peer review. Okay, career tangibles, scaffolded projects, project management skills, self-evaluations. Great. Evaluate in a childcare center or other professional environment that they might aspire to. That's great. Giving them a lens into what it is like. Excellent. Thank you for all these. I will transition us time-wise back to the presentation. And what I'm going to do at this moment is actually look at something that we've been working on to help people out to move down the path. So we've developed, we have our Curie platform of resources, and you can build teaching elements. You can even do course design using the platform. We do have AI built into many of the steps in the background, but we've built the prompting with learning theory and design principles baked in, so that the results that you're getting are not going to be your standard chat GPT. I've asked a question, I'm getting this broad thing that doesn't fit my needs. It's going to take into account the types of things you would hope to have in a teaching and learning type experience. So we have an optimizer that's called Transforming High Stakes Assessment. So this is something where you could go in and use this tool. I think it is a tool or a wizard, and you could go in and just give it context about your course, its description, the modality of your course, what the key learning outcomes are. These are things you can easily put in, copy and paste, or type in, and then describe a current high stakes assessment. In this case, it's a 100-question multiple choice exam. You're now thinking, okay, how can I get away from that? It's also worth 40% of the course grade. Anything over 20% to me is sort of a red flag. That's high stress, high anxiety. It's too limited of a scope on a learning process or measurable. And there's going to be more the anxiety and cheating, most likely around that. Why are you thinking about retooling this assessment? You can click some of those options. And then to what level would AI be a tool that students might use? So this is just a quick example. And if I click next, then you could get 3 examples of assignments you can instead consider. So a marketing campaign solution, it's got ideas for you as the instructor for your facilitation guide. It's got student-facing instructions. Another example is consumer behavior case study. Another example for here is ethical marketing podcast. So just by going through that one-page form process, you can get 3 ideas that you can start building from. They're not going to be perfect for your situation, but they're going to get you down the path a few steps pretty quickly as opposed to starting from scratch. So that's what we've tried to develop because we know instructors have so little time. Burnout is high, and in our research, 69 of instructors said they just don't have enough time to teach effectively. That's the situation people are in. So it's not pointing fingers. It's just sort of environmental thing for many reasons. So that's the type of thing we've been working on, and that's an optimizer that's relevant to today's session. We have many others. We have a whole collection on alternative assessments, which include authentic assessments. So a lot of ideas for you there as well if you want to explore. Let me go back to the slideshow and let me, scroll down to the correct position because I wasn't presenting for a while there. There we go. Juggle. And so if you wanted to try that optimizer that I just shared with you and some others, we'll have the link into the chat for you and you can go ahead and try those out. We have a freemium version of our platform where you can play around and get some things done and check out what can happen. Let me go on to the next phase. So just closing and looking ahead. I will pause here and just give my sincere appreciation to Chris and Karen for doing such a fabulous job today. Your ideas, your energy, your expertise, your authenticity yourselves, and then also the chat and the community as a great resource for making this engaging as well and very resourceful. Our next session in this series, we're going to look at pathways, credentials, and partnerships. That's going to be December 10th at 12 p.m. Eastern. And you can see a brief description there. So we have, let's see, Melanie Booth participating, Naisha Taylor. Melanie's from the Higher Learning Commission. Nisha, excuse me, is with NACE, who I mentioned earlier. And then we also have Connie Yowell from Northeastern University and the work that she's doing there. So great panel as far as our leadership webinar. So you've got the link and the QR code. And we talked about AI literacy or fluency, however you want to define it. We've been offering a free micro-credential that's about a 4-hour completion, 4 modules, hour per, where you can get a certificate or a micro-credential in AI literacy. So that is available, and we've had hundreds of faculty and designers partake in that, and also administrators too. For campuses that want to go bigger scale and do a campus cohort, we have a campus cohort kit we've developed that you can adopt and adapt, and that's a free resource. I will stop there. I always like to glance at chat at this point, see if there are any hanging questions with the 0 time we have left, ending right at the top of the hour. Great job, presenters, today. And again, thank you all for being here and for being community.